Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I spoke with Dr. Jessica Kelly, reader in design and architectural history at London Metropolitan University, about her recent book, No More Giants, J.M. Richards' Modernism and the Architectural Review, published by the University of Manchester Press in 2022.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Jessica Kelly, author, scholar, architect? Architect?
No, not architect.
Not
Not
even
architect.
Not
Not an
even-
architect.
Okay, good. Not what, like legally or actually?
Actually or legally.
Okay, we can come to
Neither.
this, we come to this in a second, but we're going to be talking about your recent book, No More Giants, J.M. Richards' Modernism and the Architectural Review, which you published with Manchester University Press this year.
It was right at the end of 2022. It came out on something like the 27th of December 2022. So it's nearly a year.
Fantastic timing by the publishers there.
Yeah.
We're just in time for Christmas or New Year or the January blues. Jessica, before we go into the book, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amber, for having me back, this time talking about my monograph. So my name's Jessica Kelly, as you said.
Dr. Jessica Kelly.
Dr. Jessica Kelly, let's be official.
Yeah.
Dr. Jessica Kelly. I am reader in architectural and design history at London Metropolitan University, where I work in the design cluster of the School of Art, Architecture and Design, which is quite a sort of defining characteristic, I suppose, of my approach. I'm sort of architecture adjacent. I very much focus on architectural topics, but I think I bring a slightly different lens on them, as you said, not being a trained architect, but I have taught architects. One of my very first teaching jobs was at London South Bank University, where I ran the history and theory units there, which was just before I did my PhD, actually. So and when they found out I wasn't an architect, some of the students were absolutely horrified that they would be taught by a non-architect, which was interesting. That was a while ago, and I like to think that might have changed now. So I'm a historian by training. Design history is kind of my focus, but I've always had this interest in what I would describe as the broader field of architecture. And I think I define architecture in broader ways than maybe just buildings.
Yeah. Pevsner's bike shed is not architecture and Lincoln Cathedral is architecture, but you're taking both.
I'm taking both, and I'm also saying that what Pevsner's writing in and of itself is probably architecture as well.
Could you unpack that a little bit? Where does that idea come from? The idea of architecture as a written process, as a cognitive game? I don't know. How would you define it?
I'd use this term field, I think. This comes out of a lot of sort of theoretical thinking in architectural history from the late 90s, early 2000s. This idea of the expanded field of architecture. It's sort of a Bourdieuian, that's not the way you say it, based on Pierre Bourdieu, the idea of the field of activity, that looks at various activities and work that would go into and define the work of architecture. And that, I think, is the historiographical basis of looking at media in architecture as a legitimate site of architectural activity, as a kind of producer of architecture, as much as architects designing buildings. The idea of producing architectural magazines can be seen as a activity within the expanded field of architecture, that the mediation that happens around what is built or unbuilt, what architects are doing and saying, how that is talked about, written about, published about, exhibited about, all comes under this heading of architectural production.
Yeah, that's a very elegant and clear description. You use the word historiography, and I think I chuck it around like ragdoll. How would you define it? I haven't prepped you with this, so it kind of puts you on your heels a little bit. But what is historiography?
Well, I love this question. I love talking about historiography. I'm actually really interested in the methodologies of history. Historiography, in very simplistic terms, is the history of the writing of history. So it's the study of how history is written over time and how it's changed, how it relates to specific cultural contexts, moments, etc. The idea that the way we write history, what historians do, the sources that they use, the types of narratives they produce, doesn't stay the same. History is a practice that has changed and evolved and has sort of paradigms within it as well. And I think the moment I described there in the late 90s, early 2000s with architectural historians like Beatrice Colomina and Andrew Higgett and Kester Rattenbury are a series of a sort of paradigm shift in how architectural history gets written and what it means to change historiography, I think, which is change how history is done, is you are looking at different sources or you're asking different questions of the same sources, or you're thinking what kind of stories can be told. I think at the core of the answer to that question, what is historiography? It's the understanding that what a historian does is a socially, culturally, politically situated practice, and you're understanding it in that context and looking at it in that. So I have been quite aware, I started my PhD, I'm going to age myself now, but I started my PhD at the end of the 2010s. And that idea of the study of media in architectural history was sort of established by then, but was potentially not kind of mainstream. Architectural history, I would argue today still, does focus on the building, the work of the architect. But my PhD research was sort of very much centered in this moment of saying, well, what is it to tell architectural history through a magazine, an architectural magazine, through the history of that publication, the people that worked on it, and putting that in a broader context? What kind of architectural history gets told by doing that? I mean, that's a phrase someone like Bob Proctor, who's written about using oral sources in architecture, which is a thing I'm also really interested in, kind of what it is to talk to people and use that in architectural history. He asked this question of what different histories get written by looking at these stories.
Thank you for that. So this turn that happens in the early 2000s, late 20th century, early 2000s, under people like Colomina and Kester Rattenbury, this is a move away from simply the apprehension of the building and the apprehension of the heroic figure, I suppose, of the architect, towards a more granular approach. And this is at the heart of what your book is about, isn't it? J.M. Richards as a character being somebody who was obviously very significant, but not an architect, not really, in his practice, who nonetheless has this central role in the curation or mediation of both the public perception of architecture and also the perception of the architect of themselves, if that's not too roundabout. Anyway, before we go there, who is this J.M. Richards, of which you write so highly?
Who is J.M. Richards? My goodness, yes. What's really interesting about this question is I've written a book about his career, and I'm still not that interested in him as a person. I think that's... There's a thing often, isn't there, about historians who study a particular individual and become really sort of evangelical about that person and how important they are. And I feel actually relatively ambivalent about Richards as a figure. What I feel is very important, and what kind of is the driving force of the book, is that point I made earlier of what kind of history can we write by looking at J.M. Richards' career, the idea of an editor, who he was. And that's where I started. And I very much didn't want to look at his personal life. I didn't want to write a biography.
No.
At all. And it's not a biography, but there is a lot of his life in it. Because what I very quickly realized in what I was trying to do originally is sort of do a history of the Architectural Review magazine and a history of the role of the editor. And what I very quickly realized is actually it's not possible to do that without understanding the life and network of the person in that role.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you said, J.M. Richards is trained as an architect. He's at the AA and the Architectural Association in the 1920s. He practices for a very small amount of time, and then by the early 30s, he's at the Architectural Press, which publishes the Architect's Journal and the Architectural Review. And he's there, and then he stays there until the early 1970s. So this sort of nearly 40-year career as an editor at these two really central publications in British architectural culture, but actually international architectural culture as well. And he has this really important career, but I was also interested in what happens with his personal relationships, his personal network, and how that becomes really formative. So he is someone who, there's bits written about him. He wrote his own memoirs in the early 80s, a book called Memoirs of an Unjust Fella, which is as boring as it sounds like it would be. Anyone who's read it will know what I'm talking about. It's incredibly dry. It's very name droppy. There's lots of, and when I was having lunch with Le Corbusier. And what's not in it is actually some of the stuff that's maybe most interesting about him, which are his personal relationships. And what I looked at a lot in the book was this moment in the 30s in particular. So this moment where he's left the AA, he's at the Architectural Review, he's married to the artist Peggy Angus, who in herself is an incredibly important figure in British art history and cultural history. She was a communist, signed up member of the Communist Party, and an artist who practiced for years commercially. She was an educator for a long time, and they were married for a period in the 1930s. And I became really interested in that milieu that he was part of, this circle of artists and architects and writers around Peggy Angus that includes people like Eric Ravilius, Helen Binion. This life of sort of socialist, politically engaged art, architecture, writing that's happening, and how it then links to this broader history of modern architecture in the 30s in Britain, the Architectural Review and what was going on. And then I was also interested in, well, what happens to that after the war? I set myself this task of trying to tell this history from 33 to 73. And that chronology was quite important because a lot of the writing about modern architecture is either looking at the 1920s and 30s, or it's looking at the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I wanted to look at that bridge and think about, that is often a story of significant change. That's often a story of a kind of radical change after the Second World War. And actually what I could see happening through the AR, through Richard's work, with real continuities of ideas and people and practices that were starting in the early 30s and shaping what was happening. To actually answer your question of who is J.M. Richards, that's who he is. He's an editor. He's a cultural practitioner. I think he's a critic. He's on the radio. He becomes architectural correspondent for the Times in 1948, and he stays there until the late 60s. He's on the BBC. He's on so many committees, I can't even tell you. I like to describe him as like a civil servant of architecture. He's very much behind the scenes. And it's that idea of who are these people, these networks of what's happening behind the scenes, and what can we understand about architecture by looking at them.
The way you've described it, it follows quite elegantly from one of your previous books, which we spoke about last time with Neil Chassor, Reconstruction, Architecture, Society in the Aftermath of the First World War. So it seems temporally to follow quite elegantly from that. Were some of the themes that you see through the influence of Richards and the AR the Architectural Review? Were they consistent with what had come before, or was, as you say, was this moment, particularly as Richards comes into his own as the editor of the AR, was there a significant shift? And you've talked about Peggy Angus. And it was funny, I was looking at her work yesterday on the internet, and I thought about Eric Ravilius, because not long ago I went to see that film about Eric Ravilius that came out that Alan Powers was a vox pop on. It was a very nice film. And
Great film, yeah.
Yeah, but I was wondering, so is what J.M. Richards does here when he takes over the reins when he becomes significant with an architectural publication, is it that he works to reorientate the presentation of architecture and in a way then the actual production of architecture? Or is it that he sits within continuity of the editors that came before, and that he sort of rode the wave of modernization that was happening at the time?
Thank you for bringing that up, because you're absolutely right. That prehistory of the Architectural Review, the Architectural Press, as it becomes known in 1926, it has a long history, and it is very important for understanding the magazine, what the magazine becomes in the 30s and then after the war. The AR is still being published, and what it is now, I think we can understand that through some of this long history. And the short answer is that a lot of changes start happening in the magazine after the First World War, which was the point of the reconstruction volume, is to start looking at the 20s as this moment of kind of activity, which is gives important context for a lot of the maybe more well-known stories of the 1930s. And I think that's definitely true of the 30s. The AR in the 30s is really quite famous. You know, most of the images of modern architecture that we call up the kind of canon of imagery is produced by the Architectural Review and their photographers, Dell and Wainwright. So it becomes very important for establishing what we understand modern architecture to be in the 30s. What happens in the 20s at the AR is it becomes a tool of publicity in a way that it wasn't before the end of the First World War. Its history, it starts in the 1896, the first issue of the AR is published, and it is a central part of the arts and crafts movement. All of the editors of the AR are members of the Art Workers Guild. A lot of them kind of sit around Norman Shaw's office. And it's very much entrenched in that narrative of arts and crafts. It's not talking about the business of architecture. But I'm very interested in how the ownership of the magazine changes at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1900, a series of advertising executives buy the magazine. And the first 2 decades of the 20th century are this struggle between the advertising executives and their commercial motivations for what the magazine could be, and the architects who are editing it, who are very against that commercial imperative and are thinking about the gentlemanly art of architecture for its own sake. After the First World War, so 1922, you get the first editor of the AR who was not a member of the Art Workers Guild, W.G. Newton. And he is the one, actually, it's under his editorship that the biggest shift, I think, in the AR start to happen. It starts to become a quite explicitly promotional site, promoting the work of architecture. So when Jim Richards arrived in 1933, that's already established. Hubert de Koning Hastings, who is the son of Percy Hastings, who was one of the advertising executives who bought the magazine in 1900, he's editor from 1926. He, along with people like Philip Morton Shand and Christian Barman, have established the AR as a promotional tool for architecture. So when Richards arrives, he comes understanding that function of the magazine, but with this kind of, I would argue, sort of politicized agenda around modernism and this idea of the link to the public. And he, I think, spearheads a rethinking of who that public is that the magazine should be talking to and how it should be talking to them. A huge focus of my book is trying to conceive of this architectural public that the AR imagines itself to be talking to, and is cultivating through its work and its connections. And Richards, as its editor, and through his network of connections to other media outlets and other organizations, he is really the one who leads that push towards taking that established promotional function and directing it towards the creation of particular relationships between the architectural profession and particular categories of public. And by categories of public, I mean middle class people embroiled in architectural decisions, but not architects themselves. It's this kind of interested layman audience that Richards is directing the magazine at, together with his colleagues at the magazine.
And this is as a mechanism for increasing sales of the magazine or for increasing sales of architecture?
That's a brilliant question, because that's exactly what it is. It's both. And that's what I think is so important about looking at this commercial dimension. When architectural magazines are talked about in architectural history and by architects, they're often, I think, conceived of and understood as a sort of relatively neutral repository of what is good in architecture, or what is important and significant in architecture. If it's published in the AR, it must be important, it must be significant. And that commercial imperative of the magazine is left out of those discussions. And the commercial imperative of architects is also left out of those discussions. It leaves the discussion at the level of art and of aesthetic judgment and aesthetic criteria. Whereas the work I've done looking at the mechanisms of how things get in the magazine, the decisions that are made, who's friends with who, and who covers things in particular ways, who writes what, reveal actually those motivations, and that the magazine understands itself, I think, as the publicity arm of the architectural profession. This is a moment from the first Architects Registration Act where the Code of Conduct doesn't allow architects to publicise themselves, to advertise themselves. So the owners of the magazines, who are advertising executives, see a gap that the press can fill. The press can publicise architects, and in doing that can publicise themselves as well. I've actually just right next to me got a book published by one of the owners, William Regan, called How to Approach an Architect, which is all about how to advertise in the AR to attract architects, but is also within that about how to sell the magazine and how to sell architecture to the public. So what you described there, this sort of feedback loop of publicity, is absolutely at the core of what's going on, I think.
So what was the kind of distribution of the magazine at this time? It must have been, because it's not huge now, but it must have been very significant.
This is one of the core, we started by talking about methodology and historiography and how to write these histories. The archive of the architectural press was lost. In the early 1970s, the magazine publishers went through a change of ownership. They were owned by Maxwell Publishers, and anyone in the UK who knows the history of the Maxwell company will understand that they went bust in the early 1980s, and during that moment, a huge amount of the archive of the magazine was just thrown away. So there's actually no records of subscription details, and even the Bureau of Circulation that monitors circulation figures for all publications in the UK doesn't have the records for the AR until 1956. So from 1956 onwards, we know there are some oral histories where people like Richards and his colleagues give anecdotal references of circulation figures in the sort of 5,000 to 6,000 up to sort of 10,000, whatever, but there's no actual evidence for that. What we can do, like you say, is try and map its influence by who else was talking about it, who was involved in it. The reality is as well, it has a very close financial relationship with the Architects Journal, which was a weekly publication and a much cheaper publication to make. It had far fewer images, and it was very much, I'd use the word trade publication of the architectural profession. It was news, it was technical information, it was published weekly, and it really was the sort of moneymaker for the architectural press, which then sort of subsidised the work of the Architectural Review, which was a monthly, much bigger, much more expensive thing to produce.
To go back to this question around the way that J.M. Richards chose to orientate the AR, there seems to me to be some kind of implication that there was, well, I don't know if implication is a bit of a negative sounding word, but some kind of sense that in engaging with modernism, there's both a commercial interest, i.e. modernism was getting built. We needed to get behind it as a profession because there's jobs to be had, money to be made, influence to be had. Is that the sense that you've got, that Richards approaches the modernizing and emancipating more egalitarian spirit of early and mid-20th century modernism because it's good business, or is he deeply wedded to the idea?
It's an interesting question. I think, first of all, especially in the 30s, there's very much an idea of publicising and promoting the work of the architectural profession in general. And that the idea of the modernist, traditionalist dichotomy, it's there. And it's certainly part of the discourse in the magazine and in the media. But my feeling is, and by looking at who's writing and what else they're doing, you can see that actually some of that tension between modernist architects and non-modernist architects is slightly an invention of the press, because it grabs attention, because it's good publicity. So I think Richards, although he would completely align himself, and he writes about being a modernist and seeing that as the future of architecture, he is also quite invested in the figure of the architect and the expertise of the architectural profession as a cultural elite, as a sort of guiding figure within society. And he wants to promote that. The magazine is invested in promoting the profession, because as much as the AR is as it's been described, a mouthpiece for modernism, and really does feature modernism a lot, it features a lot of other stuff as well. It's not a singular voice in the magazine. There's very much a plurality of conversations happening in that. But to go back to that question of like business versus ideology, I suppose, or business versus politics, of like what's the motivation behind it? I think for Richards and his circle and network of people, there is an overlap between them. The idea of whether someone's a consumer or a citizen blurs together in quite an interesting way. And Richards and his contemporaries, their main objective is to get a public audience for what they understand to be the future of architecture, which is modernism, and bridge this relationship between the profession, and seeing the magazine as a bridge. And I think to bring in some later writing that Richards does outside of the AR, in the late 40s, he writes a book called Castles on the Ground, which is published by the Architectural Press. And it's ostensibly about suburbia, and has sort of been maligned as this celebration of suburban architecture. But I write about how it's actually very much him positioning his understanding of the relationship between architecture and the public. And it's based on a very materialist, sort of Marxist understanding of the people's relationship with architecture to be based on their material conditions. He writes about how capitalism creates feelings of anxiety and precarity, which means that people look to architecture for a sense of familiarity and comfort, and that they seek social aspiration through architecture as well. And that in order for the ideals of modernism to be achieved, which is that architecture becomes modernism becomes a vernacular, a style, a popular approach for all of architecture. He said that that's what has to change, is that material relationship. While architecture is still a function of capitalism, it can't become modernist, which is an interesting moment to be writing that, because it's then immediately followed by this small window of the first Labour government after the war and the welfare state and building licenses, which for the first time do bring architects into government employment fully, as in you can't build anything without a government sanctioned license during this period of rationing. And Richards sees this as a real moment of potential where modernism could actually happen. I've gotten way off the topic in the question, sorry.
No. It's brilliant because it segues perfectly into the sort of, I suppose, the idea of the critic as a whole, which obviously Richards is central to our later idea of there's this very rarefied set of largely men, but increasingly in our contemporary period, there's women who are involved in this, of course, too. But I was just thinking about people like Raina Banham, obviously Nicholas Pevsner, as you've spoken about, Ian Nairn, even Jonathan Meades. There's this it's a kind of type. It's a character within the profession that we accept, and they're always give the impression of being slightly curmudgeonly and sort of like aggressive uncles. But there is this kind of literary quality, and perhaps it relates back to this idea of historiography as you now approach it, funnily enough. There's this idea of a kind of very personal and intimate critical voice. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and whether this is the product of Richards, or whether this is, again, there's a kind of lineage to this in the work of people like Ruskin, for example.
I mean, I'm really fascinated in this question, and this is one of the things that have stayed with me after the book project, is this real interest in this question of what criticism is, who the critic is, who gets to talk about architecture, and how do they talk and write about architecture. And there's a lot to unpack, I think. But to start from this position of what do I think Richards understands the role of the critic to be, and what type of critic was he? Where does that come from, and what legacy does it have? I think there are important things to look at outside of architecture in the 30s, looking at changing ideas around literary criticism and the idea of what criticism is in culture more broadly. You know, I'm interested in people like F.R. Leavis and what they're writing in the late 20s, early 30s about the role of the critic with a important cultural function of guiding civilization. You know, it's this idea that the critic is the gatekeeper of society. And I think to some extent Richards buys into this. There's a really interesting essay by T.S. Eliot, published in 1948, called Notes on Culture, where he sort of maps out his understanding of how culture functions. And he describes basically this sort of top-down or trickle-down model of how culture should work. It's decided by the educated elite, and it works its way down. And critics are some of the players in that process. And that, I think, models an understanding that Richards, or certainly enacts through places like the BBC, Penguin Publishing, all other organisations. This is one of the things I wanted to do, really, was put the architectural press in the context of these other media organisations, that what was happening in the AR was really aligned with what was happening at places like the BBC and Penguin, of understanding who their public was and what the role of what they were doing was. So Richards, I think, has this very top-down understanding of what the critic is there to do. He describes the magazine as a bridge between the public and the profession, but I would say that was a bridge of one-way traffic. That was not it was not a conversation. And it's that model that I think does maybe have a legacy. So somebody like Banham, and there's a chapter in the book about Banham and Nairn and what happens when they come to the AR and how do they differ. One of the things I would say is they don't differ as much as they think they do. Banham, like you've said, is not that much of a different critic to Richard. But one of the things they do differ on, I think, is this definition of the public and what is popular. And where they differ is in their approach to commercial culture, to consumer culture. Like I said, Richards has this sort of rooted in socialist Marxist perspectives of what is popular is the vernacular, it's the non-commercial, it's the folk art, it's the paintings on canals. You know, he wrote a book in the late 50s about industrial functional architecture as the heritage of modernism in Britain. Whereas Banham is writing about caravans and pop art as where the popular is. The popular is in the commercial. So they understand public taste very differently. They understand how the public expresses its taste and things very differently, but their understanding of the critic, I think, is not that different. The big change that happens is less, I think, in the idea of what a critic is and how they work, and more the medium in which they work, because television arrives. And television is doing things really quite different to what the press and radio can do. And the printed press and radio is where Richard stays and where he's very happy. He goes once on television in the late 30s and never again. Whereas Banham and Nairn are television critics. That's where they write, of course, but they also appear on television. And what I think the big change that television does, and again, I write about this in the book, is it shifts that relationship between the profession, the architectural profession, and the public. And it makes it much more difficult to have this one-way bridge that Richards is talking about. What you see in the 1960s with things like John Donnett does a report for the RIBA about how architecture should be talked about on television, and he talks about the fact that it has to be entertaining. It has to be, it can't be this very patrician kind of functional. The way Richards writes is incredibly detailed, but there's no, this is going to sound mean, but there's no poetry in what he's doing. It's very sort of straightforward, and that doesn't work on television. You've got to be a personality. That's what's got to happen. So the architectural review changes massively with the introduction of or the competition posed by television by the late 60s. And so what Richards understands the critic to do and be doing doesn't have a place in the media anymore. I think it moves into other places. It moves into thinking about kind of community architecture, thinking about questions of participation, those kind of things.
But this is a theme that pops up in your book over and over again, which is this sense that, I mean, particularly in the later chapters, with the rise of participatory voice, participatory design as one aspect of that, in the relationship of architects to the public and of modernist architecture to the public. And obviously, you've got your famous figures who resisted it. There are smaller, less well-known figures, like up in Glasgow, there were a lot of community-based activists who were kind of resisting modernisation to all intents and purposes, or post-war modernisation anyway. How does he deal with this? How is this engaged with? Because sort of anti-patrician, sort of anti-top-down, grassroots to a great degree. How does that work? And how is that then presented within the magazine itself? Because it seems to be an absolute turnaround, and it would be very difficult to be the same critic one side of that debate to the other.
There's several things happen, and I think this is, like you said, to contextualize it, we're talking about the sort of from the late 50s into the early 70s and what happens during this period. The first thing that I think Richards does is he starts to write about places that aren't Britain. He does a series of special issues about vernacular architectures in other places, in Egypt, in the Ascension Islands. He sort of goes looking for this non-commercial vernacular architecture that he believes is sort of what modernism should be becoming. He looks for it elsewhere. It's very anti-America. The AR does a series, 2 special issues about America in the 1950s, and in one of them he writes a really sort of, he's like physically uncomfortable about being anywhere near. He writes a lot about Japan, he writes a lot about Iceland. So that change happens. There's also, like I've said, a sort of real shift in how what the magazine does and how it addresses these public. And Man Plan, I think, which happens 1969 is the first Man Plan issue. It goes through to the end of the 70s. It's every other issue of the Architectural Review. And it's every other issue because Richards refuses to work on it. And him and Hastings come up with an agreement that he will edit alternate issues, and Man Plan he will have nothing to do with it, which is obviously a completely unsustainable way to manage a magazine, and that's why he ultimately leaves. Man Plan, I think, is an attempt to address the challenge of television. It's a very visual object. It's also looking at the shift to colour supplements. So newspapers start to have colour Sunday supplements, which is a new form of media in the sort of late 50s, 60s as well. So it's very visual, and it has fundamentally a different approach to the profession. It's very critical of the architectural profession. It's taking social issues, political issues that are facing the country in the late 60s, early 70s, and saying to architects, you have to address these, you have to do something, you have to do something different. And I think Richard and his sort of group of critics that sort of sit around him at the AR are really uncomfortable with that idea of criticising the profession on behalf of the public. They very much see their role as we've talked about, knowing, I'm going to say knowing better than the public, and I don't know if that's exactly what I mean, but they don't see the value in this idea of the top-down model of culture can't work if you're trying to please everybody, if you're trying to give people what they want. It has to have a directional leading thing. I often talk about a thing that Richards wrote in his last essay for the AR, where he talks to architects directly and says, please avoid the law of the brass plaque, the idea of your own fame and your own importance, and instead focus on your role of serving the public and directing the public and giving them what they need. It might not be what they want, but it is what they need. And another author who used to write for the AR, Nicholas Taylor, who published a book in the early 70s called The Village in the City, gives a similar thing. He's like, if the public are asking for, I can't remember the exact analogy, but it's like if they're asking for one thing, you don't just give it to them, because actually you have to look at what's better for the broader public. So that's, I think, ultimately why Richards can't stay at the AR, what fundamentally changes in the idea of what critics and criticism is doing is that, like you've said, that doesn't work anymore. The public will no longer sort of accept that. You know, this is ultimately a very long story of the democratization of talking about architecture. And the research I'm really interested in at the moment, which comes out of these questions that were left at the end of the book of like, what happens to the voice of the public? How do the public talk about architecture? And what I've been looking at over the last year or so has been community television in the 1970s, which is
Bloody hell.
It's fascinating. It's so interesting.
Take your word for it. No, maybe once you've written that up, we can talk again about that, and then you can enlighten us, because that does actually sound quite brilliant.
I will persuade you as to why it's really interesting. Because first of all, so you get a bunch of TV programs on the BBC at the late 60s where the public are increasingly involved. I write in the book about what I think is this fantastic program. It's actually on in 1973 on the BBC called Life is Right, The Architect is Wrong, where they have some tenants from social housing on a panel with, you know, Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry and the head of the GLC architecture department, all of these big players and these tenants who you just end up feeling so incredibly sorry for, because they are made to look completely out of their depth and sort of talk about that as well. That one of the guys is like, you know, I might not be able to talk in the clever language these people are, but I have experience of these spaces, and I think that's a value. So broadcast television is starting to try and bring the voice of the public into how architecture is talked about. But something like community television is a shift in a broader media landscape of thinking, you know, this question of who is allowed access to the media is a very relevant question in the 60s and 70s, and it's happening beyond architecture. But architecture becomes one of the topics that is addressed through community television, particularly in places like Milton Keynes and Swindon, which are two sites of community television experiments. And I'm wanting to look at how they become places where architecture becomes a contested topic and where the public can start to voice their experience. And this idea of the voice of experience versus the voice of expertise is something I'm really interested in.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's great parallels. And I said before we started recording that I don't like to talk about contemporary political things, but there's great parallels now, of course, with this idea around expertise, which obviously we went through a period of governance by experts in the recent past. And it was funny. Wasn't very comfortable at all. It's not something that we're either particularly good at doing. But I did like, just to, I suppose, to kind of bring this to a close, I like this idea of what you call the democratization of the, what did you say? The democratization of architectural production, I suppose. But more broadly speaking, the democratization of the production of architecture through writing. How is this manifest in the language used in journals like the Architectural Review? I mean, obviously, you have things like Ian Nairn's Subtopia, and the AR's Outrage column, where you get this kind of permission to be deeply upset about the failures of modernism, which is really interesting. I mean, it's a very fast fall from grace for modernism. Very fast fall from grace, perhaps one that it never really recovered from as an epoch. But what is the language like? Do we move towards a more populist kind of straightforward, as you say, less paternalistic voice? Or is it sort of the, Lord Beaverbrook, whatever his name is, Daily Mailization of public discourse? And does it foreshadow what we now have, which is in the place of essentially scholarly analysis and critique, we have sexy images and swipe right, swipe left, love heart, emojis, endorphins, it looks hot, I will design my project to look like that kind of journalism, without mentioning any names.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this I think goes back to the question that we talked about just before about what criticism is understood to be, what its function is, and how that has changed and shifted over time. And I'm very aware that what I'm writing in the book and what I've been talking about today is very much about the Architectural Review and the Architectural Press, which is one of many architectural magazines of the 20th century, but one I think that has a very specific outlook and agenda. And I think that's what I'm interested in understanding. What is the outlook and agenda of that set of people producing that magazine and what they're doing? And they have this agenda of publicity, of promotion, of working for the profession. And they create, I think, a definition of criticism of no longer being a thing which talks amongst the profession. The idea of criticism as being a thing that is there to make architecture better. You talk about what's good and bad about a building, and that should make buildings better. They create this idea of criticism, but obviously I should add to that, there's also then a professional etiquette about that. What is it to talk about somebody else's building? Who gets to talk about a building? There's all those debates.
Yeah. Good manners.
Good manners, exactly. Write about Tristram Edwards in the book as well. They start to bring this idea of criticism as being about educating the public and in that publicizing the work of the architect. So it's criticism for creating an audience and a market for architects. So it has this educational function, it has this promotional function. What starts to happen, I think, I described there the rise of television and things like that, but there's also, like you've said there with Nairn, there's a rise of the idea of criticism as campaigning, as sort of lobbying almost, or addressing the government, addressing the profession, asking for change, and Nairn does that. There's lots of people doing that in America. You've got like Jane Jacobs, who the relationship between Nairn and Jane Jacobs is interesting for their approach to criticism. That campaigning attitude, I think, starts to shift to what happens in Man Plan, which is this idea of criticism as critique, of actual direct critique of what the profession is doing with the mind for changing it. And why I think that's relevant for now and thinking about what architectural media is now and what that's become and how that idea of democratization might run through that, is it has always been dominated by architects or this educated elite. As we said, Nairn and Banham are not that different as they imagine. The actual ability for anybody else to get in and talk about architecture has been really limited. What you start to see, I think, is a recognition by the profession. And as this changes in the 80s, as architects are allowed to start advertising and are allowed to start engaging in explicit publicity, you start to see the architect as media operator becoming really important. That's always been true. The architects that we know about that are famous are those that can play the press and that can be effective PR machines for themselves and work with publicity. But that becomes even more true, I think, throughout the 70s, 80s and into the 90s. The idea of constructing a brand, how architects branding themselves becomes a really important function of architecture. So architectural criticism, I should say, what the press is becomes around branding and about sort of engaging in that. What you get then, and this is one of the reasons why community television is so interesting, is because it is a sort of precursor to what we have with internet television in the 90s, social media now, is a greater access to the tools of media, and therefore greater access of different people can talk about architecture, different voices can come in. But what that does for the profession, I think, is an interesting question. What that does for the relationship between media and the architectural profession is an interesting question. And what that social media discussion of architecture does. I think to some extent it follows a lot of the traditions of architectural media, because, you know, you look at the sort of fandom of brutalism, for instance, as an example of how architecture is talked about on social media. It's very much about style and, you know, which buildings do we like and what don't we like and why. What is, I think, interesting is starting to look at the sort of social critiques of architecture that come through social media. People looking at the sort of colonial histories of architecture, the political inequalities of social housing in Britain, that social media as a site for decolonizing or critiquing architectural history, the architectural profession, is an interesting thing. And I don't think there's a precedent for that within the press anyway.
Excellent. That's a good point to finish on. Thank you very much, Jessica. It was wonderful to hear you talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
As Ray Bradbury almost said, the things you're looking for, Montag, are in the world, but the only way the average chap will ever see 99% of them is in a magazine, or while scrolling on their phones, whichever comes first. Thanks to Jess for taking the time to speak with me. It was, as ever, a real pleasure, and thank you to Manchester University Press for the PDF of the book. See the podcast descriptions for links to Jess and to the book. And thanks for listening.